you have two apologies before I begin. First is that I might actually not be able to perform very well because of my voice and because I can hardly see. I'm visually challenged at the moment. The second apology is because I'm veering off a little bit away from what's in the abstract. But let me start. Because I neither study performance art nor follow performance studies trajectories, I accepted your kind invitation thinking that you wish me to perform the outsider. I'm happy to fill this role of the outsider, just slightly outside art, not very far away. And thank you for thinking of me as appropriate. However, there really is something that I am currently developing which may be useful to float in a room full of specialists in performance art. There really is something that I should get off my chest, actually. For this morning, I've lumped this work in progress under the provisional title, and so I've changed the title of my paper into Performing Executions, as in public killings, but also executions to mean implementation, operation, realization, accomplishing things, acts of making happen. It might be pointed out that executions are performative, period. My title is therefore a redundancy, for a reason which I am certain will be self-evident shortly. I've divided my talk into three parts. The first is endeavoring a gist of facets of our times, the times that we live in. And I'm talking specifically about today and the decade in which we're living, that concern me and the political work that I do, both as a curator and as a political animal, in the course of each day. The second is a description of a performance which is perhaps not performance art, and I'll explain that when we get to that third. And the third is a cluster of observations about what I end up describing as the performative turn in our times, in relation to performance art and in relation to conflict. And so, to the first third, which concerns phenomenologies that I characterize here as the performative turn in current events. This first third has three subtopics that are entirely happenstance. And I have to underscore the word happenstance because it happens that I am focused on these three things, and I confess that it owes to meditations I've indulged in over and through the last decade or a decade and a half, when conflict on Earth mutated into a different species entirely. And I think it's a different species of conflict entirely, and the way it's conducted or executed at the present time. That mutated species of conflict has a distinct character, I believe, built by, one, the weaponization of cyberspace, two, the hyper-real conduct of war, and three, the vigorous operations of fundamentalisms. It will not come as a surprise, I hope, to you, that specific works of performance art, artists allowed me to think through these defining phenomenologies of conflict in this present decade and decade and a half. I said happenstance, and by this I mean that I encountered particular performance art events that assisted me in thinking these matters through. In particular, let me begin with, I'm sorry, there's something wrong with me. I'm reading 500%, I'm sorry, it just skips. Energy, Butter Dance by Melati. You are all familiar with this, and that's part of the reason I chose this. Melati Suryadarmo. All right. It's familiar to all of you. It was a work she performed in many global cities, and of course each performance transpires differently. I should like to point out that the scale of difference of every performance is of an entirely other order than that which occurs rather naturally with the differentiation from night to night in any given theater performance, any given production of a theater piece having an extended run. Butter Dance, like I said, I'm sure you're familiar with this, has helped me think of life in cyberspace, believe it or not. During nearly the exact period, Melati performed various iterations of this work. I tried to follow the work's various stagings online at the same time that I tried to understand in Tagalog nagkataon lang. It just happens that it was going on at the same time in my life for me. At the same time that I was trying to understand the operations of ISIS in its propaganda and recruitment operations. For me, the juxtaposition was, again, a bit of a natural thing, however weird this may sound to some of you. If you bear with me for a bit, let me explain how Butter Dance obliged me to recognize the necessary performativity of all that grisly material online. The beheadings are not mere executions. They were and are performed executions. It would not do at all to veil these events. Terror is precisely upfront or not at all. The destruction of archaeological sites in the territories subsumed under the rubric of the Caliphate. These were extreme manglings of already quite mangled form, of the already quite mangled form of the reality show, and so on and so forth, notably including the recruitment of the disaffected and the absolutely alienated children of post-colonial diasporas. The porous and indeed collapsed boundaries between parallel realities, between consumption of information and the inner workings of formative psyches, up the ante on realism. However, the operations of that realism of a different order is of a different order of things entirely from the immediacies of Butter Dance. It's realism and then realism. Real and then real. It's upfront and then upfront, but quite different. Even if Melati's embodied articulations of entrapments as formative self-regard did overlap with any given ISIS recruitment video or beheading. Butter Dance was not a setup. It cannot be appropriated into propaganda, cannot be weaponized to be wielded in hate campaigns. This imperviousness, this work on vulnerability, which is nevertheless invulnerable to, first of all, digitization, and second of all, to trafficking in signifiers of essentialisms. This quite possesses me. Until now, as I undertake curatorial and political work that hopefully implodes realism of the ISIS variety. More on this as I conclude this paper. As you can see, my paper is quite personal, and I allow myself this because of the embodied nature, really, of performance art. And whatever it is that I have to share with you from my kind of outside position is very much what I carry around in my own body from experiences. So, the next experience I'm going to talk about, I'll quickly leave Butter Dance to cite a work that you may or may not have seen. I don't know if you're familiar with 3 posters. Have you seen 3 posters at all in the last decade and a half? This is the work of the performance artist Rabi Mroué, the Lebanese French performance artist. this his first time to perform this was nearly a decade ago. I caught this in Berlin. 3 posters consisted of videos found by chance of men who had themselves filmed, who had themselves videotaped immediately before their run as suicide bombers. In the videos, the men described their own sense of their own mission, why they're doing it, and how they're doing it. And curiously enough, a number had repeat videos. The videos had many versions of the same take, so to speak. Presumably so that the men can choose the best performance of this act of committing to their mission a priori or prior to the mission itself. Rabi posed the question the time that I saw this performance about when the suicide actually occurred, when the body was blown into bits, or when the videotape happened. Because the videotape was the performance that defined what was about to happen. Rabi also performed a similar videotaping session. The conduct of war at the present time is of course different from the previous decades and centuries, though, needless to say, not merely because of technological change. 3 posters had quite early allowed me to think through the order of difference. Today, war is conducted as performance, as staged, as produced in the same way as entertainment. The media is embedded. There's scripting and deliberation to seduce, to manipulate grief and alienation, to manipulate towards heroic states of being, to mobilize this passion in the case of drone attack videos of bombings, or to mobilize passion in the case of Mad Max battle scenes. Even if the metaphor of theater of war has been around for many decades, the executions are not realized as metaphors. The would-be suicide bomber on video enacts its mission already as the video is made. 3 posters, a very old work now, it's a decade and a half old, continues to ricochet inside work that I do today that needs to comprehend the conduct of war globally and locally. I mean, there are really distinct performative aspects, like, for example, I just read 2 days ago in The Guardian that bombing hospitals is part of the conduct of war now. Now, there's a particularly nasty undertow to bombing people who are already in a hospital and to attacking Médecins Sans Frontières, which is a particularly incredible image. And if you're going to stage something performatively, attacking Médecins Sans Frontières is actually quite a good image. While the suicide bombing has not occurred in the Philippines, where I live, there is a daily onus in my location to understand performativity as violent conflict is prosecuted by many parties at the present time. Those parties nearly all traffic in fundamentalisms, essentialisms, reductions, gross simplifications, that the world and the human condition is by no means confined to or confinable to these reductions have been the personal value to me of a particular performance that I was involved in. It was called 1,000 Nights. Are you familiar with 1,000 Nights? By the performance artist Barbara Campbell. It was performed over 1,000 days. And I'm sure you know that she's referring to Scheherazade. Barbara, this is a rather old work again. It involved reading, Barbara reading a newspaper, a morning newspaper broadsheet every day for 1,000 days. During that reading, wherever she was in the world, she would read at the same time. And she would pick up a phrase from her morning reading of the newspaper, which she then executes immediately as a watercolor of the words. She videotapes the watercolor and she sends it by email to one of many writers around the world who will work with that phrase. I was one of the writers. There were many writers. I worked on about 3 of these stories. So the task of the writer is to receive the email of the watercolor and to use the words as the first words in a short story of 1,000 words, which should be written before 12 noon, which the writer will then send back to Barbara for publication in her website, 1,000 Nights. So wherever the writer was located in the world had to actually abide by her particular clock. She also put a tongue ring so that she can replace a metal part of her tongue ring, videotape herself so that everyone knows that the thing was done on that particular day of the series of 1,000. So the writing contributed, the short story could be anything, but the phrase had to be the phrase that she picked up. The story, which had to be written before half of the day is over and emailed to her, would then belong to the body of literature that, like Scheherazade, had to be written under duress so that the world goes on, so that life goes on. At this point, Barbara was just widowed. This intensity of 1,000 nights and 1,000 days of this was also her embodied coping with widowhood. As one of the writers, I participated in the exquisite element of surprise, the joy of the discipline of writing, indeed as Scheherazade, and obliged to create a tale under duress to save life, and in performance as embodiment within an unknown collective. There was a collective of writers whom none of whom knew it well. Some knew each other, some didn't. I didn't know the entirety of all of the writers writing for Barbara or with Barbara. It gave me to experience extreme nuance, synchronicity that nevertheless moved unexpectedly, and a sense of the political as fecund. With this performance as well as Melati's and Rabi's, I think of weaponized cyberspace, the conduct of war, and the operations of fundamentalisms as spaces for quiet, productive thought that nevertheless sustains me in the harsh political landscapes that I navigate daily. So I cite 1,000 Nights here because it allowed me to enter a domain in which fundamentalisms were rife with a tremendous sense of subtlety and lack of stridency. It is not my intention to celebrate these artists. I'm taking the pains to insist that I'm not celebrating these artists at all, privileging them. Nor the names to follow, nor do I cite them to promote an instrumental view of performance art. I'm not using performance art to think, but it happens that this embodied knowledge that came about in the encounter with these 3 works is part of the way I think. The works were not useful to me. I'd like to emphasize that because I don't like the word useful. Rather, the works were and are embodied thought that I know in turn embody, that I now in turn embody in the conduct of my engagements. There were other artists, and I wish I could cite all of them. It's not possible to cite all of them now. But I now have to go to the second third of my presentation. I'll jump to it. So let's leave all of that. Before I leave it, the weaponization of cyberspace, the conduct of war, and thirdly, the operations of fundamentalism, which I think about constantly. Now, the second third of this paper concerns a tour guide who has become something of a celebrity for both the highly performative, singular style of his tour guiding, mainly through the old Spanish-built city of Manila. His name is Carlos Celtran, and I have a little photograph of him, who enjoyed a fine arts education and was well known enough to have caused a furore in 2010 when he began campaigning against the Roman Catholic Church stand against a piece of legislation that was taking 20 years to pass. And this was called the Reproductive Health Bill, which would have and now does allow anyone who needs contraception. This will be funny in Thailand, I think, but it really took the Philippines 20 years to allow contraception to people who need contraception. Mainly because the Roman Catholic Church and its medievalisms have actually been actively against it. Anyway, Carlos was against the church because of this. The run-up to the final decision was fraught with malicious intent, mainly from the conservative Catholics and their church hierarchy, who stooped rather low, to try and stop this piece of legislation. Carlos Celtran marched into the 400-year-old Manila Cathedral, and the Filipinos here would know about this little event, in 19th century costume of the emergent bourgeoisie of the 19th century. In the central aisle of the venerable cathedral during Mass, he flashed a sign that said Damaso. Now, Damaso is the name of a sordid character in a novel. He was a fat, lecherous priest. In the novel, Noli Me Tangere, written by Jose Rizal, the Philippine national hero, at the end of the 19th century. Now, just a little bit of information. Rizal was executed by firing squad by the Spanish colonial administration for writing this novel and a sequel novel, essentially anti-friar diatribes woven into a 19th century novel. There's a lot that's been written about this, particularly starting with Benedict Anderson. But this twin works of literature is understood by all Filipinos as the harbingers of the Philippine Revolution of 1896 and the declaration of the First Republic in Asia in 1898. Now, Celtran, in flashing the name Damaso in front of the Catholic priests in that August precinct during Mass was quite a performance. He was, of course, escorted out of the church. He was charged with some obscure law protecting the sanctity of religious spaces, and he was put in jail, briefly. There's a little bit of a jail picture there, and then we can, yes, that's him in jail. All right, so we can stop looking at the slides now. Those are my only slides. I cite Celtran, the Celtran performance, for an entirely different set of reasons as the first three performance artists that I mentioned, very different. Let me read my sentence. For very different reasons as those that emanated from my encounters with the first three performance artists I cited. In fact, it would be valuable to recognize Celtran as performing a pivotal turn between art and not art, because his performance floats without the support that sustains art making, because he's not really part of the art community, certainly not the performance art community, most of whom are here. He's a tour guide, so he doesn't really belong, nor does he belong to the support structures of activism, because he's not really a known, he doesn't have a lineage in activism either. So what was this act? It's it's an out on a limb conceit that has no pull on academic attention, nor a hold on the sympathy of peers. Now, I'm not putting it down. I'm just describing a situation in which someone does something like this, goes to jail, and is really not part of anything. He's not part of the performance art community, not part of activism, not part of academia. He's a tour guide. By the way, he's now in Bangkok because the death threats to him for another part of his life had become so extreme that he has to leave the Philippines. It is of interest to those such as myself who are inclined to floating as well, just outside art, but never fully within a social context that demands vigilant criticism. Let's provisionally call it a liminal space, although I have my reservations about calling it a liminal space, but for the purposes of just this morning, let's go with that. Politically, the performance did not persuade nor dissuade the debating fronts. The Reproductive Health Bill was passed, finally, through quid pro quo allegiances within Congress, non-permanent, among senators and representatives of the people. The Celdran performance was a sideshow to an utterly significant historical event. At least to me, it's utterly significant. The Catholic Church of the Philippines, if metaphorically a fortress, was breached at this point. It gave way. But Celdran had little to do with that event, I think. So why am I mentioning him here? I am attracted to precisely its mock heroic pointlessness. It's very attractive to me. The futility, the pointlessness, without for a moment privileging the idea of the anarchic gesture. Let me venture a few remarks that perhaps are only possible to make by dwelling on or inside of that liminal space. Liminality, of course, facilitates appreciation of amorphous location. And here I get to, I think, the part in which I address what Ray Langenbach mentions to me about region. And this is me in this section conversing about region because I have my reservations about region. The Celdran performance, which transpired in Manila, that is, yes, a metonym for the Philippines as a body politic engaged in social issues to be resolved in a Congress of Representatives. But it is a Manila, Philippines, that ill-fits the location called Asia, nor Southeast Asia. It is a Manila, Philippines, whose performative meanings or coordinates have to include Mexico and the rest of South America. It's not Southeast Asia in which you will find the coordinates for picking up stuff from this quasi-performance. Let's just call it a performance. This location in which I live, already nebulous, is furthermore encompassed by a nebulous Spain of the past. The relevant cartography is limbed on several temporal registers, therefore. I mean, there's very different kinds of time. And geographies, not quite what is comfortably Southeast Asia or Asia. And here, I'd really like to point out that the sense of the cartography of the work that is being done by you within art, within this region, have tangents that do not that cannot be encompassed in the old area studies of the past. Development work is very big on area studies, but you know, my profoundly being moved by Rabi Mrue's 3 posters allows me to think a tangent to the Middle East, which exists in a profound way between the Philippines and that part of the world, etc. A firmer sense is acquired of the infirmities of national boundaries whose imaginaries lend to regional and continental imaginaries. One is quickly disabused of the comfort zones in which we either forge or jerry-rig our links between the personal and the political. Now directly looking at performance art through the nebulousness of the liminal, there is a confronting but distinct possibility that has to be accommodated. It is to do with a futility so clear in the Celdran performance, which is a futility shared, I think, by all art in relation to the political. Whether something is produced as art within the field of cultural production or as quasi-art, quoting arts methods, whatever it is, does not impact anywhere near the impact of a performed beheading. Specifically with regard to performance art, whether it is affected intra-art or just outside its precincts. That is to say, whether it is performed by Celdran, donning a period costume, or Ai Weiwei breaking exquisitely expensive china, the act exercises little or no suasion over the trajectory and momentum of political events, which is not to dismiss art, nor art's reproduction in the public sphere. But I am trying to comprehend the power of the beheading performed for mass circulation as distinct from the power of art to move me to tears, so to speak. Or literally. I have to refer to one last time to the Celdran performance, which did give me pause when I first heard about it on Facebook. It was the irreducible, unrepeatable, utterly singular moment when he hoisted the placard that said Damaso in the middle of the August Cathedral, in the face of the altar and its priests, and amidst the faithful, the recognition of the sign within the universe of that church service that must be described as instantaneous in its signification, as instantaneous as an incendiary, as a grenade lobbed into the church and a grenade that exploded. The moment was powerfully human from being fraught with agonies memorialized in the foundational novel that created the Philippine nation, and for having hauled into the church the suffering of families with too many children in a country whose majority religion is a Christianity possessed still of medievalisms. I hope you will not be offended if at this point I cite, without comparing, I'm not comparing at all, the moment Marina Abramovich opened her eyes to see Ole during that encounter in the museum, during her performance. I cite this moment because I think all of you know of it, so it is a good signifier. Indeed, it is a signifier par excellence of an irreducible, unrepeatable instant, a moment, an intimacy so powerfully clear that is presented untainted even in its well-circulated video reproduction. The moment was the result of a highly crafted setup by an artist that required that artist's great discipline, endurance, and fortitude. The fortitude Marina is known for, the discipline. It is discipline, it is endurance, it is fortitude, whose absence in Celdran's work keeps his work outside art. However, there was that moment that I now deliberately contrast with the banality of an ISIS beheading. Its performed qualities focused on shock value of the ISIS videos, complete dehumanization of both executioner and his object, gives us to understand that terror operates properly as signifier of reproducibility. That terror is possible because of the threat of reproducibility. It can be done unto you, anywhere, anytime. The performative turn in current events, therefore, which aligns well with the weaponization of cyberspace, the conduct of war as it is right now, and the operations of fundamentalisms, mobilizes the dynamics of hypothetically endless reproduction. Each repeat is mere meme, visual shorthand that jettisons complexity. Paradoxically, the whole thing operates on the truth of a real death. In this sense, it is a snuff film, always. That snuffed life passes on to the life of simulacra, which Baudrillard has taught us to understand as reproductions of reproductions with no original. The dehumanizing original is mere fuel to the dynamics of the simulacral reproduction. And I'm using the words ISIS video as shorthand for a huge number of things out there. But every time Melati Sridharma falls during her butter dance, which is a moment of exquisite irreproducibility, which I surmised may not have political power, moves me to tears. I'm sorry to be emotional. During those falls or failures to stand, I connect with fragility, with nuance, with complexity, with vulnerability. I connect with jouissance. And while I'd be the last person to make a case for the power of art, I don't make a case for the power of art. I do think that the idea of nuance and jouissance might have something to say in conversation with the fundamentalisms on earth right now. Thank you very much.